At my wedding reception, I wasn't admiring the cascading orchids or the elite guest list of the Moore family. I was staring into a copper backsplash I had spent 3 grueling months restoring by hand. My name is Isabella Kingsley, and as a restoration architect, I've learned that materials are honest, even when people aren't. Polished to a mirror finish, that copper was my silent, unblinking sentry. In the world of high-end construction, copper is the ultimate teller of truths. It records every thumbprint, every scratch, and in this case, every crime. That's how I saw her. My new mother-in-law, Lucy Evelyn Moore, was standing directly behind me. To the room, she looked like a portrait of old-world grace in her champagne-colored silk gown, a garment that probably cost more than my first 2 years of college. To me, she was a structural hazard. Lucy thought I was distracted by the vanity of my veil in the reflection. She didn't realize I was tracking her movements with the clinical precision of a site survey. I watched through the copper as Lucy pulled a small amber glass vial from her clutch. With a steady hand, one that suggested she had done this before, she tipped 3 clear, viscous beads of liquid into my champagne flute. She didn't know I was an architect of structural integrity. She thought I was just a fixer-upper girl who had tricked her son, Julian, into a marriage below the Moore station. She saw me as plywood, cheap, replaceable, and temporary. I didn't turn. I didn't scream. I waited. She glided away to greet the governor, her heels clicking with the confidence of a woman who believed she owned the world. And then, with the calm of an engineer assessing a hairline fracture, I reached out. My hand didn't tremble. I simply switched our glasses. The poison was now in the hand of the woman who had brewed it. To understand the weight of this moment, you have to understand the foundation of our hatred. 6 months before the wedding, Lucy had summoned me to the Moore Ancestral Library. The room smelled of old leather and unearned privilege. She sat behind a desk that had belonged to a railroad tycoon, looking at me as if I were a termite in her mahogany walls. "Isabella," she said, sliding a creamy, heavy envelope across the wood. "I've done a cost-benefit analysis of your relationship with Julian. You are a restoration architect. You appreciate the value of a clean slate." Inside was a cashier's check for $250,000, more money than my parents had ever seen at once. "This is an exit grant," Lucy continued, her voice like silk over a razor blade. "Julian is a pediatric surgeon. He is a Moore. He requires a wife who can navigate a gala without checking the blueprints for the ballroom. Take the money, Isabella. Go find a nice crumbling brownstone to fix up, and leave my son to a woman who matches his bedrock." I didn't tear the check up. That would have been too dramatic. I simply slid it back across the desk and said, "Lucy, your check isn't large enough to cover the structural repairs your son needs after growing up with you. I'm not a tenant you can evict. I'm the architect of his new life." That was the day the static load began to build. An hour before the reception, during the formal photos in the rose garden, the tension reached its breaking point. Julian had stepped away to take an emergency call from the hospital. Lucy Evelyn Moore smoothed the lace on my shoulder, but her touch felt like a structural inspection. "You know, Isabella," she whispered, barely audible over the clicking of the photographer's shutter, "a building can look beautiful on the outside, but if the soil is contaminated, the whole thing is eventually condemned. You've built this marriage on a swamp." I met her gaze, smiling for the camera. "I agree, Lucy. That's why I always check the bedrock before I start a project. And I found something interesting when I looked into yours." She leaned closer, her perfume cloying and sweet. "The Moores are bedrock. You are plywood. You're a tenant, darling. And your lease is up tonight. By midnight, Julian will see you for exactly what you are. A messy, unstable girl who couldn't handle the pressure of our world." She adjusted my pearl necklace, pulling it just tight enough to graze my windpipe. "I've already prepared the paperwork for the annulment. I'll make sure you're taken care of. Consider it a renovation fee. But don't think for a second that your name will ever truly be Kingsley." Walking back to the head table for the reception, I felt the static load of the ballroom pressing down on me. In engineering, static load is the silent, immense weight a structure carries before it snaps. The chandeliers above us, 3,000 pounds each, hung on steel bolts and physics. But the Moore dynasty? It was held up by nothing but air and lies. Julian squeezed my hand as we sat down. "You look radiant, Isabella," he whispered. He had no idea that just 10 feet away, Lucy was raising a glass meant for my social execution. I looked at the champagne. Golden, bubbly, deadly. Across the table, Beatrice, Julian's younger sister, fidgeted with a strange nervous energy. Her eyes darted from Lucy to me, and back again. That's when I realized Lucy wasn't acting alone. In architecture, a single pillar can fail, but a total collapse usually requires multiple points of weakness. Beatrice was the second pillar. I watched Lucy take a long, triumphant sip of the tainted champagne. I waited for the nausea to hit her. I waited for her to stumble, for the drug to cloud her eyes. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Lucy was laughing. Her eyes were bright, sharp, perfectly focused. She wasn't sick. My heart began to hammer. Had I switched the wrong glass? No, I was certain I hadn't. Then I saw it, the signal. Lucy caught my eye and gave a subtle, precise nod toward Beatrice. Beatrice was holding the third glass, the one that had been sitting untouched beside the ice bucket the entire time. That's when it clicked. Lucy hadn't drugged just my glass. She had drugged the entire bottle, the flutes meant for the head table. But she and Beatrice had taken a preemptive binding agent beforehand, a medical-grade antidote Julian kept in his surgical bag. She wasn't trying to make me vomit. She was trying to make me unravel. The drug was a powerful hallucinogen. Her plan was to trigger a public psychotic break, right there in front of 200 high society guests. She wanted Isabella Kingsley to look unstable, a drug-addled girl who couldn't handle the Moore name. I realized then that switching the glasses was just moving a single brick. I was fighting a coordinated demolition. If I took a sip of anything on this table, I would lose my mind in front of the world. "Julian," I whispered, my voice like cold steel, "don't drink the toast, not a drop, and tell the waiter to take your glass away." "Isabella, what is this? It's my mother's tribute to us," he said, confusion and concern lacing his tone. "Trust me, I'm an architect. I know when a foundation is rigged to blow. If you love me, you will put that glass down right now." I didn't just sit there. I used the extinction burst logic, a narcissist's final explosion of energy when they lose control. I knew Lucy would have a backup plan, a narrative to explain my collapse. I stood up, pretending to feel dizzy. I leaned into the microphone. The room went silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "A toast to the Moore legacy, a legacy built on secrets. And as a restoration architect, I've spent the last year uncovering every single one of them." I saw Lucy's face go ashen. She immediately signaled the waitstaff to help me off the stage. But I didn't move. Instead, I pulled out my phone and cast a video file to the giant projectors, the ones meant for our childhood memories slideshow. The screen didn't show photos of me and Julian as toddlers. It showed a blueprint. Specifically, the technical blueprints for the Moore Manor restoration I had completed last year. "I found something during the restoration, Lucy," I said into the microphone. "Behind the mahogany paneling in the library, a hidden vault, a safe that hadn't been opened since the 1980s. I let the room absorb that before I continued. And inside that vault, the original, unedited ledger of the Moore family trust. The truth was devastatingly simple. The Moores were a hollow shell. They were old money with no money left. Lucy had been embezzling from Julian's medical trust and Beatrice's inheritance for over a decade, all to maintain the illusion of grandeur. Every gala, every designer gown, every so-called exit grant she offered me, paid for with stolen money. The poisoning attempt wasn't just about spite. It was desperation. If she could make me look mentally unstable, she could convince Julian that I was draining him. And once she did that, she could convince him to sign over his power of attorney, before I ever had the chance to expose the truth. The room went silent, a vacuum of disbelief. I swiped the screen to reveal the forensic audit, the millions flowing into offshore accounts in Lucy's name. "She's hallucinating!" Lucy screamed, her voice cracking. "The stress has broken her! Julian, do something!" But Julian wasn't looking at me. He's a surgeon. He reads data like a patient's vitals. And now he saw it. The numbers. The funds meant for the pediatric surgical wing he had spent 5 years planning, drained. The name Lucy Evelyn Moore stamped on every fraudulent transfer. And then the poison did its work. Because I had switched the glasses, Lucy had unknowingly ingested a double dose of her own hallucinogen. The dose meant for me, plus the traces left in her own glass. The antidote she had taken, only calibrated for a single, diluted amount. The overload hit her like a wrecking ball. Lucy began pointing at the walls, screaming that the copper was bleeding and the floor was turning into snakes. She collapsed into a heap of silver silk and bile, her carefully curated mask melting into a puddle of chemical-induced terror. The paramedics arrived, but they weren't there for a bride. They were there for a matriarch who had finally poisoned herself with her own greed. The night didn't end with a dance. It ended with the police. Lucy was led out on a gurney, still screaming about the bleeding copper. Behind her, the governor and the senator made quiet exits. The Moore name was radioactive. Julian and I stood in the middle of the empty ballroom. The smell of bile and lilies hung heavy in the air. He looked at me, eyes wet with a mix of grief and gratitude. "You knew," he said. "I'm an architect, Julian," I replied. "I'm trained to see the cracks before the roof falls in." We didn't go on a honeymoon. Instead, the next month was spent in lawyers' offices. Beatrice, realizing the ship was sinking, turned state's evidence against her mother in exchange for immunity. She admitted to helping Lucy source the drugs and hide the ledger entries. 12 months later, Lucy Evelyn Moore is in a state-mandated psychiatric facility, awaiting trial for embezzlement, fraud, and reckless endangerment. The Moore Manor was sold at auction to cover the debts. Julian and I moved into a modest townhouse in the city. No copper backsplashes, no mahogany libraries, no hidden vaults, just an honest foundation. Right now, I'm sitting at our kitchen table, repairing a ceramic vase we broke during the move. I'm using kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with lacquer mixed with powdered gold. The philosophy is that a piece is more beautiful for having been broken. The cracks in our life are visible to everyone. The city knows the Moores are a fraud. The world knows our wedding ended in a police escort. But the gold, the truth, is what holds us together now. I am Isabella Kingsley. I don't just restore buildings anymore. I restore lives. And I've learned this. The most beautiful structures are the ones that were once completely shattered, only to be put back together by someone who knew exactly where the gold should go. If you enjoyed seeing a toxic foundation crumble, hit that like button and subscribe to join our community of restoration and revenge. Have you ever witnessed a structural failure at a wedding? Or maybe dealt with your own Lucy Evelyn Moore? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one.